Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday the 7th of November and you're joined by myself, Philip Nothard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. So this is episode 390 of All the Chatter That Matters. And you know what, Phil? It's been a bit of a busy week since last Saturday when we uploaded the last podcast.
And not just for the automotive industry either, has it? I mean, that's the thing with this. It's we're trying to cram, obviously, some of the key headlines for the automotive sector into the podcast, but, I mean, there's so much going on elsewhere, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, let me just take you through some of the highlights outside of the automotive sector since last weekend. So we had Halloween and Bonfire Night. We lost Sean Connery, still the best Bond in my book, and apparently even Roger Moore's book. Roger Moore rated him as his best Bond. We also lost Nobby Stiles, the 1966 World Cup and Man United legend. Staying with sport, England won the Six Nations. But that was a tournament which started way back at the beginning of February. M&S suffered its first financial loss in 94 years. The Bank of England announced quantitative easing to the tune of £150 billion. England entered a month-long lockdown, which has now been dubbed officially Lockdown 2.0, and that, of course, has prompted the furlough scheme to be extended until next March. And there's also been an election in America.
Yeah, don't go there.
So the world has moved on since last weekend.
What an election that is, and it's not going to be over yet, is it? I do feel for the US at the minute. There's a lot going on over there, and we're sat over here watching it amusingly, I suppose, in many ways, with late nights and early mornings to try and see what's happening. And there's still probably quite a few days left on this one, if not months probably.
Yeah, as we record this, we don't know the outcome, and I suspect after we go out, we still won't know the outcome.
Well, I suspect even if the outcome is there, it'll be contested anyway. So we won't go into the world of politics, and definitely not in the world of US politics either, because that is a very contentious area. And but it is actually very interesting. I don't know if you've been watching some of the social media, but you know there is a bit of social media from the in the UK from senior execs talking about what's happening in the US and talking about the speeches. And I think you mentioned it before the show, didn't you? That I don't think we expect a gracious speech at the end of it, no matter what happens here.
Definitely not. It won't be of the same calibre as John McCain's concession speech.
And we can't forget, we had the interview with Derren Martin this week as well. We grabbed him very quickly, just between calls and meetings, and just got his view on the fourth quarter, the movement of the used car values, his thoughts around and sharing what he was going to do from a Kappa HPI perspective through this lockdown 2.0, as you've put it, and some of his thoughts on 2021 and looking at the market going forward. So, as always, that interview will be at the end of the show, and we'll try and get him switched over to a reasonable Wi-Fi signal for his mobile phone, or do it on Skype next time, because his signal does go a bit. But I did jokingly suspect that he's probably had a busy morning on his mobile phone.
Yeah, apologies for the sound quality. It's definitely worth listening to, but I think his mobile was actually going into meltdown as we recorded the interview. So do catch that at the end.
Exactly. And we've got some headlines. We've got some, we've been long-awaited results and other headlines this week, haven't we?
We have, yeah. So meanwhile, back to the automotive world. Headlines this week: new car and van regs for October. Cars down, vans up. The SMMT has forecast the full year market downwards. We have some exclusive October used car market trends from our sponsors eBay Motors Group, showing just how encouraging the market was looking ahead of the England lockdown. And talking of the lockdown, we've chosen a posting from Robert Forrester, which is kind of words of encouragement to customers and the sector in the face of the lockdown. We asked the question: will furloughed staff be paid their October commissions? And finally this week, we named the fastest milk float driver in the West, and it's no longer Ernie.
Yes, yeah. So we'll get on to the first story. We're heading over to Motor Trader initially on this one. There is a number of stories on obviously the results for October, but we've got the new car registrations in October fall to a 9-year low, and that's down from 143,000 to 140,000. So that's a decline of 1.6%, which actually it is a decline, but in context, it's not. It could have been worse in many ways, but obviously there was predictions that we might have seen an increase with the pent up demand and the focus on getting registrations into the market. I don't know what your thoughts were on this one, Curtis.
Yeah, you're right, and it's worth pointing out that there's a couple of things to give it a bit of context, because October last year was down, and that was, I seem to recall, that was due to the supply issues around the changes in rules and regs regarding emissions. So last October was down. Retail this year actually held fairly steady, because it actually grew by 0.4%, and business was up as well. That was up, I think that was up 4%. So yeah, it's I think what we were expecting to see were more of the September plate change sales happening in October, because we knew that some of these supplies had been affected by factory closures and the delay and rationalization of model lineups, but maybe we didn't see that. And fleet certainly was hit in the month, because that was down 3.3%. So the drop was led by fleet this time round.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, going before sort of 2019, which was 153,000, 2018 158, and earlier than that 180,000. So the 143,000 that we saw last year was a significant fall on previous years anyway. And again, there is a point in the story there from the SMMT with Mike Horse talking about, obviously we had the early lockdown for the fire break in Wales that did influence the result for the month of October. But again, very tough month, and we're heading to the next phase of this, and in some of the European markets as well. And I like to talk about some of the European markets, Curtis, but they fared fairly poorly. I mean, China was up actually. China from a recovery perspective, I mean, they were up 11.4% last month, and the US was up 1.1%. But actually, some of the European markets, France was down 9.5%. Spain, not too bad, 0.2% down. Italy 0.2% down. Spain hit a little bit harder, 21% down in Spain, and Germany 3.6% down. So in context to the UK, we fared pretty reasonably from a year-on-year perspective from in October compared to those sort of European partners over there. But again, it's not in context to a normal seasonal month, is it? And that's the bit that everybody seems to be talking about at the minute.
Yeah, exactly. And the figure I was looking for regarding private registrations October last year were actually down 13%. So to recover by 0.4% up this year is, that's not bad going. A few winners and losers. So Audi, they were up 51% in the month. Jeep were up 11%. MG were up 126%, Mini up 25%, and Vauxhall up 38%. But most of the brands actually recorded losses over the course of the month, and the only brand in the year to date that's recorded a gain is MG, who were up 58% in the year to date, and the market as a whole is up Up. It's down. It's down 31% for the year to date. So that's for the first 10 months.
And there is a good story covered the figures, a little bit more detail in AM, isn't there? Going into a lot more of the sort of the reduced forecasts of as you mentioned at the start there. The headline is the same about lockdown 2 and the fire break to result in the worst annual car sales since 1982, and this is where the SMMT have published their reforecast that was expected in October. It got delayed till obviously this week on the 5th of November, but they have reduced their 2020 forecast backwards, haven't they, in light of the lockdown and the fire break.
Yes, so they were forecasting 1.66 million registrations this year, but as you say, because of the fire break and the lockdown in England, this has been reforecast down to 1.56 million units. So that's a loss of 100,000 units, which, if that pans out, we'll see 750,000 fewer cars registered in 2020, which the SMMT equates to a £22.5 billion loss in turnover of cars being sold, with 2020 now likely to be the weakest year since 1982.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing with this now. We're not necessarily going to see those vehicles come back. I mean, we lost over 600,000 through the initial lockdown. I suppose in one way, luckily, the month of November and December is a lower volume months in terms of that volume market compared to your Q1, Q2 territories. But again, significant drop, taking that sort of lost registrations from 600,000 up to the 700,000 as well. And essentially, I say those vehicles may never ever come back into the sector. We may have lost those for good now. So again, has a significant impact on used cars in terms of that used car wholesale market as well for the future. So a lot of conversations taking place, and people from Sue Robinson from the NFDA, Ian Plummer from Auto Trader, and many others having a view on the impact of one, the results of October, and two, what the lockdown will mean for the sector.
Yeah, and the car market was down, but as we said at the beginning of the show, the van market was actually up. So the next story is from Motor Trader, and the headline is "Lockdown to Halt Recovery in Van Sales Following Record October." So registrations of vans, according to the SMMT, in October were up 13.3%. So that's the highest performing October on record, and that equated to just shy of 29,000 vans, pickups and LCV 4x4s being registered over the course of the month, following a weaker than usual October 2019, and that was for the same reasons for the car market, with WLTP approved vehicles not getting into the market soon enough. So a record for October. Growth in demand was driven by the heavier end of the van market as operators expanded fleets, very much ahead of the Christmas season, with registrations for vans weighing over 2.5 and up to 3.5 tons. They were actually up 26.8% to 20,500 units. So some real strength in the market there. But the jury's out now, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we as you know, I do the Insight report each year, and that's imminent. And a lot of the focus within that Insight report is looking at the 2021 figures for the new and used car market, but also the van sector. And it's interesting when you're looking at it, and the readers, when they do get to see it, the van market is not, the impact on the LCV sector is a lot more positive. It is a positive marketplace. It has shown the strength. The lockdown doesn't help, but that demand and the change in behaviours that we've seen through the lockdown 1 and lockdown 2 now look to stay, and that is supporting that LCV market. And I think we did see activity within the LCV market from people like Robert Forrester and others that kept their operations busy within that click and collect market. So we'd too potentially expect to see activity continue through this second wave of lockdown, but again, not necessarily up to the same volumes that we would expect for this time of the year, unfortunately.
Yeah, and now next up, we've got an exclusive.
We have.
So we have, yeah. So this is from eBay Motors Group, and it's their market view for October. So despite the regional lockdowns across parts of the UK during October, many dealers actually enjoyed strong used car performances. And this, according to the research done by eBay Motors Group, was on the back of rising retail prices, reduced days to sell, and increased stock levels, indicating some encouraging market dynamics. But that was before the announcement of Lockdown 2.0. What did you make of the findings?
Yeah, I mean, very, very interesting. I mean, looking at some of them stock profiling and activity that the dealers are having, and when you're looking at things like the average days in stock being 44 days, and September 20 was 47 days, but compare that to October 2019, it was down to 39 days. Stock volume per dealership is at 50. September 46, but actually October 2019 was at 60. So there's a lot of dynamics at play here, particularly when you start to dig into the detail between the franchise, independent and supermarkets, as well as to some of the activity around those average days in stock and volumes of stock per dealer, where there's some significant shifts. And it is going to be interesting to see in terms of that activity now, what is going to happen in this second wave. Activity has remained fairly strong compared to where you would expect it to be as we've got to come into this first wave of lockdown. I think there is a view that the retail market are better prepared than they were the first time round. They've got processes in place. They've got social distancing measures in place. They've those that didn't have a robust e-commerce proposition either got one or brought forward, as some of our interviews through it seems a long time ago now, some of those interviews, Curtis, but yes, those interviews that were held right at the start of the first lockdown, where we know that some of the larger groups brought forward their strategic plans for that digital proposition for that consumer, and a lot of those are now in place, and they've had those in place either before the first lockdown or since the lockdown. So I think essentially the feeling at the minute is that the retail market are better positioned than last time. We did see easing generally from a consumer perspective, but we've got to remember, the clocks have gone back. We are in the middle of the fourth quarter of the year, and I think Christmas isn't too far along around the corner. So, I think there is dynamics at play and trends at play that would normally be at play at this time of the year anyway. Yeah,
and just a final part comment on that story, because it does relate to the interview we do with Derren Martin, and that's on pricing. So pricing for October averaged an increase of 2.6% to £12,931, and there were increases across the board. Franchise prices were up 2.6%, car supermarkets were also up 2.6%, and independents were up 3%. Now, we know that October had a price correction, but that was in the wholesale market, and there is always a lag, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in November.
No, I think you're right, and I think a key message going out to dealers at the minute is just hold firm. Profit is key. And keep holding out for that profit. So it'd be great. It's very, very insightful, and this report will get shared at some point to the listeners.
Yep, but you heard it here first. So you're listening to All the Chatter That Matters on the Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group, the only weekly podcast serving the car retailing sector, and available by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favourite podcasts.
So we've got a bit different now. So since the lockdown was announced at the weekend, I mean, we know every business was extremely busy, communicating and what the next stages were for their operation. But and Robert Forrester, it was no different. He's put a report out, or a statement, announcement out on his website, and it's an update message from Robert Forrester, who's the CEO of Virtue Motors PLC, and we've had him on the podcast numerous times. And I think it was great to see that, Robert, along with people like Sittner's, Marshalls, Cox Automotive even, was straight out as soon as they possibly could with their plans and messages for their customers. But I think you quite like the one from Robert, because it was quite to the point, quite brief, but getting the message across to their customers.
Yeah, you're right. There were messages put out by Marshalls and Hendy and the IMDA. Lots of them did, but the one that caught my eye was from Robert, because it's on the Bristol Street Motors website, so it's aimed at customers, but it's also aimed at the industry. It's aimed at all of us in the industry, because he does actually spell out the do's and don'ts and what Virtue as a business will be doing in England during the lockdown. So it's sort of outlining that, okay, showrooms are closed to the public, but Virtue will still be offering a remote sales service, offering collection services, and he makes it quite clear that there will be a designated exterior handover area at the dealerships. And in the statement, he does advise customers to bring a coat, which sounds like good advice. But he also points out that after sales will continue, as will MOT services. So it's not business as normal, but it's business that can be done, and showrooms, certainly throughout the Virtue network and many of the other franchise networks and independents, will continue, but the doors will remain shut to customers.
And you're right, and it's really highlighting those sort of facilities that are now in place. They're talking about the sales teams will be in the dealerships to continue their sales remotely. They'll be able to send you videos, talk to you via the video, and that's all to meet the consumer needs. So really sort of getting that message across that, all right, you can't just walk onto a forecourt, or you can't walk into a car showroom, but actually you can continue your purchasing process and engage with the sales teams. And as you said, if you want a home delivery, the options are there for a home delivery, or they can all be, go and collect it, as you say, there in a click and collect environment. Take your coat, as you say. So I suspect it's outside in this cold weather that we're now experiencing. But again, really spelling that out to the consumers that they're there to support and continue business where possible. So I think we are in a lot better place, as I said before, than we were first time around with this.
Yeah, lessons were learned first time round, so processes could be put into place pretty swiftly after last weekend's announcement, and that's clearly what's happening throughout the franchised and independent sectors.
And you pointed out right at the start there, so we're heading over to the car dealer again, and this is really looking at the furlough scheme, and it does come up every time, this, doesn't it, from a car sales commission perspective. And we know that the furlough scheme was set to end at the weekend, after it had obviously that reduction measures from 80 down to 70 and then 60, if I remember correctly, and then it's then being extended for a month. throughout the lockdown, and more recently Rishi has then announced that it will now go all the way to the end of March in terms of the furlough support. But it has raised that question again around salesperson's commission, which we know is a large proportion of their annual income from a salesperson's perspective, and when the government support measures come in place, they don't always support that commission structure, do they? And this has been called out by Car Dealer from a business legal firm, CG Professional, who have been commenting on that area.
Yeah, the headline is, should sales staff be paid October commission if they're on furlough for second lockdown? The answer is yes. And they sought legal advice from CG Professional, and managing partner Stacey Turner said dealers will be liable for any commissions earned by sales execs in October in accordance with their contracts of employment and in accordance with general implied duties of the employment relationship. So pretty straight there. Yes, they are entitled to it, and yes, they should get it. So that'll be welcome news for sales execs across the country, especially if they are facing furlough now.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the furlough this time around, because it's some people haven't. I mean, there's comments going around the industry, not necessarily just automotive, but I do feel sorry for a lot of these people involved with it. That some of them, by the time end of March comes in place, some people will have been on furlough for a year.
Yes, yeah.
And there's been some people that have lost their jobs at the end of the last furlough scheme, and they're now out of work and not able to benefit from this second wave of furlough. So lots of conversations taking place, both good and bad. But I think we are in as you say, a fluid situation with these kind of things, as always, aren't we?
Yeah, and let's end on an upbeat note this week, shall we?
Yeah.
So finally, we're heading over to This Is Money, and the headline, Guinness World Record for the fastest speed reached in an ice cream van. Now, at the beginning of the show, I did highlight that it's no longer Ernie who's driving the fastest milk cart in the West. It is Paddy McGuinness, who anyone who watched Top Gear last weekend will know that he set himself a challenge of trying to beat the world record for a milk float, and he's done it.
Yes, yeah, he has, yeah.
In a rather spectacular way. So the record stood at 73.92 miles per hour, but he beat it by going 80.04 miles per hour. And the ice it's not an ordinary ice cream van.
No,
so
it's far from it.
Anyway,
no,
yeah,
no.
Anyone who didn't watch it probably need a bit of context here. So it's actually a 1979 Bedford CF ice cream van, but it's plonked on top of a 1980s Land Rover Defender chassis. It's got Tesla running gear, and it's powered by Mercedes and Tesla batteries. So it's rather souped up, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I did actually, I'll admit, I did watch that episode, and I'm not so sure about the Mr. Whippy replacement with sausage and mash that was also being served from that same van as well, for anybody that did watch it or are going to watch it. But yeah, it's certainly not the ice cream van that you'd be expecting anytime soon to pull outside your house in the time when lockdown is lifted and ice cream vans can come around and serve you Mr. Whippies. But it's worth a watch, and definitely it's certainly not your standard, like you say, your standard ice cream van. But head over to either This Is Money, the video is on there, or obviously it's on iPlayer anyway, as the episode is. But yeah, it's quite amusing.
And we should add that it's the van is called Mr. Nippy.
Yes. Yeah. Top Gear has certainly changed over the years. Certainly now, it's I'm not sure in the early years of Top Gear these kind of stories would have made the news, but yeah, it's definitely changed.
I do remember when it was a consumer program, but that was a long time ago.
You remember them days, yeah?
I do, yeah.
So that is it for this week, and I mean, what a roundup of headlines, and there is many more. And as always, we do say that head over to some of the medias that we've mentioned, whether that is Motor Trader, Car Dealer Mag, AM Online. Some of the stuff that is coming out from these guys is really up to date. They are reacting very quickly at the minute to the news as it lands. Car Dealer Mag continue to do their regular videos. There's a lot going on, and as you said right at the start of this, Curtis, not just within the automotive sector. I mean, the news headlines are just continuous, aren't they, in general? So again, we're trying to summarize everything up for you, but we've got a lot going on at the minute.
Yeah, so that's all for this week's headlines roundup, but do stay tuned for our interview with Derren Martin, Head of Valuations at CAP HPI. He does give the lowdown on the October correction, realignment, talking about November, Q4 and into next year, and the impact of lockdown 2.0. So do stay tuned for that. You've been listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Do join Philip and I again next weekend for all the chat that matters. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard, and Curtis Hutchinson to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast interview brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group.
Regular listeners will know from last weekend's podcast that CAP HBI has revised its average used values downwards by 2.1% for October. So our guest today will provide an update on what prompted the move, how the rest of Q4 is looking, and share some thoughts on whether the lockdown in England will have an impact on values. So a warm welcome to our special guest today, Derren Martin, Head of UK Valuations at CAP HPI. It's great to have you back on the podcast, Derren.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be back. Thank you.
Hi, Derren. Well, I mean, again, as Curtis said, welcome back, and obviously busy time for you this week. I think it was after the weekend's announcements, but we last caught up back in the beginning of October when you kindly shared some of your views on the used values that were trending going into the fourth quarter, and obviously we're now in this fourth quarter. So since then, we've had people are sort of talking about a correction, but we've had this kind of drop in values and a bit of a realignment to the market as was expected, and I think you talked around for the fourth quarter. And can you talk us through some of the reasoning for that move and some of the data and analysis behind it?
Yeah, we've moved values down during October. So in our live products, values moved down by 2.1% on average, and the reason for that mainly is it's what we've been seeing in the trade data. The data that we get from around 50 sources has shown that the market has dipped away. I think businesses are being careful about what they pay in the trade. Bearing in mind we're going into a fourth quarter, prices are already high, and economic situation and things like that. Bearing in mind, obviously, October was before any announcements were made, the movements we made before any announcements were made at the weekend. So values were already dropping in the trade, not so much so in retail. So trade does tend to move first, and I think there was some reluctance to pay previous high prices, being a little bit careful. So that's probably a bit of a summary of what we saw during that time. So it was an interesting month. We predicted that values would drop. That 2.1% is quite a big drop for the month of October going into November. But put it into context, that values have been strong over the last few months. So it has to be put into context.
And it still remains fairly high year to date, doesn't it? I mean, that's where again, putting it into context, it's still a fairly strong position from a full year trading perspective so far compared to a normal period of trading.
Without a doubt. So values, tracking back from over a 12-month period, values are between 3 and 4% higher than they were this time last year, and that's tracking the same vehicles at a 3-year, 60,000 mile point. So the same type of vehicle at that age compared to the same vehicle at that age last year. That doesn't generally happen. Cars will deflate, cars will depreciate as they get older in their life cycle, and supply and demand nuances and things like that. So for them to be ahead of where they were is unusual. It's obviously off the back of a very unusual year. Now they're starting to come down, but there would have been businesses that would have been writing them down by around 5%, and then they're 3% up. So as you can see from that, there's still some room for cars to be sold, and businesses to still make more than they were expecting to at this time of year.
And Derren, in terms of the values, what trends did you see across the various vehicle sectors? Were there any winners as well as losers?
We generally saw, you always get winners and losers when the way we look at the data. You're looking at individual models, individual generations, and it's all down to supply and demand in the used car market. So there will always be some winners, but generally most things moved down. City cars and super minis were probably the most heavily affected in percentage terms, coming down between 2.5% and 3%, which in 1 month is quite a big drop. But those are the cars that went up by the most over the last few months. So what goes up must come down is generally true with used car values. So they've had a little bit of a realignment. Some lower medium cars, that's probably the next one that's come down the most, 2.5% for lower medium cars, which is sort of the Astra Golf Focus size vehicle. And we've also seen hybrids continue to probably be the weakest fuel type. So hybrids, not necessarily unpopular, but they are just seen as too expensive versus their petrol and diesel equivalents. So they came down slightly more than the average. So it's generally a picture of things going down. Probably one of the strongest was large SUVs that actually performed okay. So they only dropped by 0.5%. So again, that's not too much. So yeah, it's probably the smaller end that was most affected. We also saw a little bit of strength on younger used cars, where maybe people were, or dealerships were switching from new into used due to longer lead times and things like that. So they weren't too badly affected either.
And in terms of the market, how has it been? What's the response been like from obviously dealers and the wholesale market? Because I think you say it was we knew it was going to start to ease. We know the fourth quarter of the year tend to be a little bit softer generally. Was it a welcome move? What's the reaction so far to the figures?
Generally, when you do drops like this, because that 2.1% is quite a big drop when you put into context of previous months. Usually the phone is quite hot and ringing and finding out what's been happening. That's not necessarily been the case. We've had very few manufacturers that queried the movement. Dealers, if they're close to it, will know what's happening in the trade. They'll know that this was coming. As I say, I don't think retail values have been as heavily affected as trade, but they've seen it happening in the trade market. So there's no real surprise on this, and I think I'm not necessarily sure it'd be welcomed, but I think probably people were expecting it.
And Derren, I noticed in the press release, which only went out last week, you hinted at a further value drop in November. The world's moved on since last week. We've now gone into lockdown for England. So, is this still on the cards? Is this further drop in November?
In my opinion, yes. The early data that we're seeing from sort of back end of last week and early this week would suggest that there will be continued drops. We don't see it dropping off a cliff. There are, from obviously the announcement was made on Saturday. The first 2 days of this week have been quite strong. There are some cars being sold cheaply, but there are also volumes being sold. And what we're seeing in the data so far is that they overall values are not dropping dramatically, but they do continue to decline. So I would continue to say that I think values will come down over the next few weeks. Mainly because of high previous prices, some of those demand factors now disappearing, pent-up demand, people buying to avoid public transport, those sorts of things have probably happened. And in quarter four, it always tends to drift away with prices. People start to turn their minds to other things towards Christmas. And obviously, you've now got the economic impact, which was always going to be felt. There was going to be the end to furlough. It's now been extended, but there's no doubt that there will be an economic impact and people being a little bit more careful, with consumers being more careful. So I would continue to say that I think values will drift away. There are some cheap cars being sold out at the moment, and I think prices will drop, yes, but we will purely reflect what we're seeing. I don't want to be one to talk the market down. It's just what we're seeing early days at the moment. Things could change very much once we go into full lockdown. So it will be interesting to see what the situation is next week and beyond.
And the big question, obviously, you mentioned it there in terms of lockdown. You know, we had the announcement on at the weekend, and obviously it comes in action tomorrow, well tonight, this evening, as we're recording today. And so, you know, there's a lot going on and lots of conversations. As you said, you know, you've been a busy week this week so far. But you know, what impact, if any, will lockdown have, do you think, on the valuations in England? And I suppose more importantly, what is your stance? Because I think, you know, that's been the key message, I think, this week from yourself on interviews you've been doing, is what you're doing with the values, because obviously everyone's looking back to what happened during the first lockdown, and we're now on lockdown 2.0. Can you share some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so when we went into lockdown at the end of March, it was a very different situation. People were told not to, so people were basically stopping going to work. The auctions kind of stopped straight away. Car dealers closed, and most weren't set up to do click and collect and deliveries, and also they weren't even sure that they were allowed to do those sorts of things. It was a very different situation. We've now got used to this, and auctions will remain open, and we've spoken to a number of those this week. Car dealers will stay open as much as they can. Some of the smaller ones may well close and furlough staff if they feel that they can't, they won't get the business in during this time. But dealers are open to click and collect. Auctions, some of them have reopened physically, but they will now stop doing that. It will remain online. The way the auction industry got set up to be purely online during that sort of April-May period, that was absolute testament to them. So that will continue, and there will still be cars being bought and sold. The consumers will still be able to go and buy. Dealers and car supermarkets and the like will still get to buy trade. So that will continue. So I think volumes will drop, but we will still have enough volumes moving values. So we will not be pausing anything this time round, and will be being moved, and we'll see what happens, basically, because we will be reflecting that. So we look at retail advertiser data, we look at trade sales data, and we'll be continuing to do that. And we've got a team of experienced editors that will be continuing to do that. So it's, for us, it's very much business as usual, although a little bit unusual times, and we'll be seeing how things go with regards to valuations back through the month.
Great.
Yeah, and finally, Derren, seasonal trends have pretty much gone out the window this year, along with just about everything else. But we're now in the final 2 months of the year when values and demand traditionally drop in the run-up to Christmas, and it's hard to imagine that not happening this year. So, just looking ahead, what trends are you forecasting for Q1 2021?
There'll be a little bit of a pick-up in January. I see values as dropping in sort of right after Christmas, but as I say, not dropping off a cliff as things stand, although that will depend on vendors too with their prices, and then obviously how much they're retailed for and that type of thing. But I do think January will be a bit of a pick-up. I think there could be people, businesses buying cars now, and over the next few weeks for January, if they can hang on to them until then buying over the next few weeks and then selling them in January would seem to be a good move. Obviously, there's so many unknowns though, with the pandemic, with Brexit, what will happen with all those types of things. But I think there will be a pickup in January, and I think the first quarter maybe okay. We do get maybe weakening again after that, when there's more volume coming into the market from previous years and from the lease extensions that have happened over the last over the last few months. So personally, I think it's a little bit of a rundown into Christmas now, and then pick up in January. But we've never been in this situation before, and who knows how long the lockdown's going to last for. Fairly confident we'll come out of it on the 2nd of December, but a lot can change in that time. So it's that'd be my view, that it will be maybe a tough few weeks for prices, but maybe some stability and a little bit of a pickup in January.
No, I mean that's good insight there, Derren, and thanks for joining us today. And it's a very brief call, and I think your mobile's starting to give up a little bit and ready to. It's been burning all week, I suspect. So I think you're right. I think a lot of this needs putting in context. We are in the fourth quarter of the year. We are approaching Christmas and everything else, and we're not in the same lockdown as we were the first time around. So I think there's everybody's got to take a pragmatic view with this and put everything in context. So I mean, just for me, I appreciate you coming on. And I think you're right. This is it's key to share this information to listeners because, as you say, a headline figure doesn't necessarily tell the whole story these days, and we are in an unusual and a very unseasonal marketplace. But I mean, just thanks for coming on today, and thanks for sharing your insight.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, many thanks, Derren, for a welcome update on how used values are trending at the moment and how Q4 and Q1 could start to shape up. That's all we have time for now. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast interview brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Do join Philip and I for our weekly roundup of the latest industry headlines, which will be available from Saturday morning. Until then, thank you for listening and goodbye from us.